Hey everybody, welcome to Sweet Jesus. Because ice cream is sweet, but Jesus is sweeter. This is episode 11, and we are taking a look at chapter 9 of The Reason for God. The knowledge of God is the chapter. And I hope you've got your treat for the evening. I'm getting a little bit later start, but wanted to get one of these in. I'm not going to be able to do it next week, and just wanted to make sure I got one in since I missed last week. But keep plowing through this book, trying to get through and enjoying some tasty treats along the way. I hope you've got your favorite dessert. You've got pie, you've got cake, you've got a cupcake, you've got whatever, a cookie, a brownie, whatever your favorite treat, something sweet. I've got ice cream. That's my favorite. Sweet Jesus, because ice cream is sweet, but Jesus is sweeter. Tonight, I have got another flavor from Just Ice Cream and a Bit More. They're closed now for the season. That stinks. But this is another one of their amazing flavors. I have yet to be disappointed. And it's called Holy Schnikes, which, if you've seen Tommy Boy with Chris Farley, is a movie from the early 90s. Hilarious. That was something he said all the time, Holy Schnikes. And it's basically like a Snickers flavor, essentially. There's I forget the kind of ice cream it is, some kind of peanut buttery ice cream with caramel swirl and lots of chunks of Snickers in here. It's really good, really, really, really good. So I hope you've got a moment here, if you haven't started already, to take a taste of your delicious, tasty treat. These guys are really good. What I love about this new place we found, Just Ice Cream, in Brewster, Ohio. A little bit of a drive for us, but what I love is every single time it is just chock full of all the good stuff in there. So delicious, delicious. All right. So last time we talked about the clues of God, sort of just the tail end of the clues of God. This time it's the knowledge of God. And I think, what the second half of the book is really dealing with. He's trying to give reasons for faith. He's trying to point out, particularly here, how we all really know that there is a God, even if we deny that, even if that's what we confess, that we say there is no God, we don't believe in a God. Even if we say that, our lives say something very different. And we'll get into this a little bit here as we go through the chapter. But essentially, if we really lived like there was no God, we would live very, very differently. But because that is just so intolerable for us, we actually live like there is a God, because the alternative is just too depressing and horrible, and the world just would fall apart and descend into chaos. So that's kind of the background. It comes out a little bit more at the end of the chapter, but starts out here at chapter 9. These opening quotations and things I find very interesting and very enlightening, very helpful to get started. There's a back and forth dialogue here. Of course, there's a God. We all basically know there is. I don't know any such thing. And then, of course you do, when you think to yourself, and most of our waking life is taken up thinking to ourselves, you must have that feeling that your thoughts aren't entirely wasted, that in some sense they are being heard. I think it's this sensation of silently being listened to with total comprehension that represents our innate belief in a supreme being and all-comprehending intelligence. What it shows is that some kind of belief is innate in all of us. At some point, most of us lose that, after which it can only be regained by a conscious act of faith. You've experienced that? No, I haven't. I hope to someday. So, kind of illustrating this idea that we sort of know that there is a God, and here even someone is defending that idea and they don't even believe. They haven't even had that moment, a conscious act of faith. But interesting enough, just to think about our own conscience, not our conscience, we'll talk about that later, but our own sort of stream of consciousness thinking and all that's going on up in here. Most of our day, we're thinking things. Even before we're speaking, we're thinking things. And when we're on our own and we're just kind of contemplating, and, I think there's a sense that we're all kind of thinking in a direction, thinking towards someone, and just kind of an interesting thing. I don't know that comes out much in the chapter. I think it's just an acknowledgement trying to prep us for this idea that we all sort of have this innate sense that there is a God. All right, so on to the chapter here. Conservative writers and speakers are constantly complaining that the young people of our culture are relativistic and amoral. But Tim Keller says, as a pastor in Manhattan, he has been neck deep in sophisticated 20-somethings for almost 2 decades, and he has not found this to be the case. The secular young adults I have known have a very finely honed sense of right and wrong. There are many things happening in the world that evoke their moral outrage. Right? So he's saying we have this perception that people that don't believe in God have absolutely no morality. They don't believe there's any right and wrong. And actually, that's not the case. And that's actually been my experience too. Secular people, people that are not of any particular faith, they have some strong opinions still about right and wrong. In fact, in some ways, their thoughts, their opinions are far stronger than even our own. It's kind of interesting. But he says here, there is a problem with their moral outlook. And that's kind of what is behind this entire chapter, just taking that apart, that essentially we all still have some type of morality. And the challenge is that if we dig deep enough and we think hard enough about this, what we'll realize is that the only way that you can actually base your strong sense of right and wrong on anything, the only way that you can take what you believe to be right and wrong and sort of promote it and propagate it and lead to any kind of moral obligation is you need God. And without God, all the arguments about why people should behave and why things should be a certain way and not other ways and why people should be treated a particular way, they all fall apart without God. That's sort of the nutshell of this chapter, but taking it apart piece by piece, each of the aspects to the arguments that people will throw out there. So, all right. He's talking about this one couple that came to him for spiritual direction. He says they didn't believe in much of anything. How could they begin to figure out if there even was a God? He asked them to tell him about something they felt was really, really wrong, and the woman immediately speaks out against practices that marginalized women. He said he agreed with her fully since he was a Christian who believed God made all human beings. But I was curious why she thought it was wrong. She responded, women are human beings, and human beings have rights. It is wrong to trample on someone's rights. I asked her how she knew that. Now, puzzled, she said, everyone knows it's wrong to violate the rights of someone. He says, most people in the world don't know that. They don't have a Western view of human rights. Imagine if someone said to you, everyone knows that women are inferior. you'd say, that's not an argument, it's just an assertion. And you'd be right. So let's start again. If there is no God as you believe and everyone has just evolved from animals, why would it be wrong to trample on someone's rights? And her husband responded, yes, it is true. We are just bigger brained animals. But I'd say animals have rights too. You shouldn't trample on their rights either. And so Tim Keller asks whether he held animals guilty for violating the rights of other animals if the stronger ones ate the weaker ones. No, I couldn't do that. So he only held human beings guilty if they trampled on the weak. Yes. Why this double standard, I ask? Why did the couple insist that human beings had to be different from animals so that they were not allowed to act as was natural to the rest of the animal world? Right? So why should we not do what every other animal in existence does? Why did the couple keep insisting that humans had this great, unique, individual dignity and worth? Why did they believe in human rights? I don't know, the woman said. I guess they are just there, that's all. Now he kind of says, hey, just so you know, it didn't go quite like this. That conversation was much nicer. We laughed, we had a good time. But this conversation reveals how our culture differs from all the others that have gone before. People still have strong moral convictions, but unlike people in other times and places, they don't have any visible basis for why they find some things to be evil and other things good. It's almost like their moral intuitions are free-floating in midair far off the ground. So, again, the essence of the chapter, why is there right and wrong? How can you get upset about what you believe to be right and human rights and defending the weak and all of those things? Nature teaches us that the strong eat the weak. The strong kill the weak. And that's how they stay strong. That's how they survive. So why would we do anything else? Well, just because. Well, that's unfortunately kind of the way most of these things wind up going. He quotes a Polish poet here. He's talking about all these deeply moving words pronounced with veneration in places like Prague and Warsaw, words which pertain to the old repertory of the rights of man and the dignity of the person. But I wonder at this phenomenon because maybe underneath there is an abyss. After all, those ideas had their foundation in religion, and I am not overly optimistic about the survival of religion in a scientific, technological civilization. Notions that seemed buried forever have suddenly been resurrected. But how long can they stay afloat if the bottom is taken out? Right? So if we gut religion, we take out religion, we gut the thinking of our day and philosophy of our day, we just gut it out and take out religion. What is there left to stand on? How long can this possibly last? So now Keller says he believes this poet is right. I think that people will definitely go on holding to their beliefs in human dignity even when conscious belief in God is gone. Why? Radical thesis. He says, I think people in our culture know unavoidably that there is a God, but they are repressing what they know. So basically, we're not really interested in having God tell us what to do. We want to essentially pick and choose our morality, and so we get to sleep with who we want to. We get to live a life of pleasure and ease, but we can still talk about human rights and all kinds of other things. So I think that's kind of where he goes. Maybe not all in this chapter, but I think that's sort of what's behind that. Sorry, I need a little more ice cream, fuel. Holy shnikes, great stuff. So when he talks about the concept of moral obligation, very common. I'm sure you heard this. You should never impose your views about anything on anyone, because everyone has the right to find truth inside him or herself. This belief leaves the speaker open to a series of very uncomfortable questions. Aren't there people in the world who are doing things you believe are wrong, things they should stop doing no matter what they personally believe about the correctness of their behavior? If you do, and everyone does, which is true, doesn't that mean you do believe that there is some kind of moral standard that people should abide by regardless of their individual convictions? But this raises an important question. Why is it impossible in practice for anyone to be a consistent moral relativist, even when they claim to be? The answer is that we all have a pervasive, powerful, and unavoidable belief, not only in moral values, but also in moral obligation. Um, there are a couple of good stories that come out a little bit later on. We all have moral feelings. We call it a conscience. Moral obligation is the idea that regardless of whether someone thinks it's right or wrong, they got to abide by that. They got to do that, or they got to not do that. And this young couple that he talked about a little bit earlier, they had no doubts that people in other cultures should honor women's rights, for example. But though we've been taught that all moral values are relative, we can't live like that. In actual practice, we inevitably treat some principles as absolute standards by which we judge the behavior of those who don't share our values. And what gives us the right to do that? If all moral beliefs are relative, nothing gives us the right. Nothing. Nothing gives us the right to tell anybody what to do. If you're a moral relativist, right? There's no idea, concept, philosophy. There's nothing there to give us this right to tell people to stop doing what they're doing. And yet we can't stop telling people that they're wrong. It's pretty amazing. People who laugh at the claim that there is a transcendent moral order do not think that racial genocide is just impractical or self-defeating, but that it is wrong. The Nazis who exterminated Jews may have claimed that they didn't feel it was immoral at all. We don't care. We don't care if they sincerely felt they were doing a service to humanity. They ought not to have done it, right? And so this is something we believe in morality, and we constantly try to impose our morality on others, whether we are religious or irreligious. It's just what we do. We're human beings, and as Keller said earlier, this is betraying some inner belief in God, regardless of whether we're willing to confess it or not. But it's just this deeply held thing that we are either repressing or embracing, and we want to hold people to it. And I think you see that on both, if you think about politics, on both the left and the right. So the right, the conservatives, have a lot of evangelical Christians, and they think that it's okay. It's a moral thing. It's a human right to defend the life of an unborn child. And they will do all kinds of things to make sure that no one can harm the life of an unborn child. On the other hand, you have people on the left who maybe are okay with that, but there are all kinds of other things that they are not okay with. They are not okay with racial discrimination. They are not okay with anything that infringes on the rights of a woman or represses women, or equal pay, all kinds of things like that. And they are willing to say that this is a moral obligation and we must impose it on others, even if we don't believe in God, right? Why? Well, because it's just right. So we all have ideas and thoughts and moral standards that we believe should be used across the board, whether or not someone likes it or not. Okay. Now, then he gets into here the evolutionary theory of moral obligation. Common answer, he talks about the clue killer idea, which we already sort of debunked in a previous chapter. But And he gets into this sort of self-sacrificing altruistic behavior toward his or her blood kin. The evolutionary explanation is that altruistic behavior might result in a greater survival rate for the individual's family or extended clan, and therefore result in a greater number of descendants with that person's genetic material. For evolutionary purposes, however, the opposite response, hostility to all people outside one's group, should be just as widely considered moral and right behavior. Yet today we believe that sacrificing time, money, emotion, and even life, especially for someone not of our kind or tribe, is right. So sort of it could be both that would get propagated in a particular set of DNA, human DNA, that altruistic behavior would serve people well, and so maybe it would get passed on. But also, he's saying it should be just as likely that someone that is out to get everyone that's not in their tribe or clan, that would actually also help that DNA survive. And so we should see that equally present in all people. And yet we actually see this altruistic idea far more prevalent in the human race than any other idea. I mean, people that thrive off of the killing of anyone that's not them, I mean, those are few and far between. Usually people that are damaged somehow, emotionally, cognitively, people that just have no concept of other people. It's a serious psychological dysfunction, and it's a very, very small percentage of the population here. So, jumping in a river for somebody, we see, how could that trait have come down by a process of natural selection? Jumping in the water, not just for somebody that's part of our clan, but somebody who's not, maybe even for an enemy. Why wouldn't we just let them drown? We usually feel bad if we don't. We feel guilty. How could that trait have come down by a process of natural selection? Such people would have been less likely to survive and pass on their genes, right? So if you're constantly being altruistic and sacrificing yourself for other people, you wouldn't be more likely to die, right? Like, you jump in a cold, frozen river to save somebody, or even if it's not a cold, frozen river, you just jump into a river to save somebody. I mean, they get kind of nuts. They teach you when you're learning life-saving skills, you got to protect yourself from the victim, because you could easily become the victim as they panic, and they may pull you under and hurt you and wind up getting you into serious trouble as well. So you're less likely to survive and pass on the genes. So on the basis of strict evolutionary naturalism, the belief that everything about us is here because of a process of natural selection, that kind of altruism should have died out of the human race long ago. Instead, it is stronger than ever. So just another dent in this idea, some of these evolutionary ideas. Evolution, therefore, cannot account for the origin of our moral feelings, let alone for the fact that we all believe there are external moral standards by which moral feelings are evaluated. All right, then the problem of moral obligation. It's a real problem for people with a secular understanding of the world, and he talks about an anthropologist here who is, anthropology, it's a field where cultural relativism is the dominant view. You can't, there's no basis for objectively judging one culture's morality to be better than another. And yet this woman, this anthropologist, was appalled at things that she saw in other cultures, particularly practices in societies she was studying that oppressed women. She decided that she would promote women's interests in the societies where she worked as an anthropologist, but of course this creates a big problem for her because it's rooted in a socially located, individualistic mode of thought. What right did she have to promote her views over those of the non-Western societies where she worked? And her response, anthropologists This is a quote from this anthropologist Carolyn Fleur-Lobin. Anthropologists continue to express strong support for cultural relativism. One of the most contentious issues arises from the fundamental question, what authority do we Westerners have to impose our own concept of universal rights on the rest of humanity? But the cultural relativists' argument is often used by repressive governments to deflect international criticism of their abuse of their citizens. I believe that we should not let the concept of relativism stop us from using national and international forums to examine ways to protect the lives and dignity of people in every culture. When there is a choice between defending human rights and defending cultural relativism, anthropologists should choose to protect and promote human rights. We cannot be just bystanders. But of course, she just simply declares that women are being oppressed and feels she has to stop it. And we have to bring our Western values to other nations. Our values are better than theirs, period. Right? So a moral relativist can't actually exist in moral relativism. In fact, the very idea that, hey, all truth is relative and you can't impose your beliefs and practices and ideas on rights and all those sorts of things, you can't impose those on anyone else. We have to find it for ourselves. That itself is like a standard. We've talked about that a little bit in other chapters. But notice, here is an anthropologist, this woman, who ignores God, who does not embrace the idea of a God, and yet acts as if there is, because she's acting as if there is a basis for her to impose this idea, these ideas, these cultural ideas on others. I would say for good reasons. She's thinking about people that are being oppressed, but she doesn't actually have a basis for it. She's just saying, I just think it's right, and so we're just going to do this, and I don't care what my anthropology background tells me. It's wrong, and I'm going to do something about it every time. I'm going to defend rights, human rights, and I'm not going to defend moral relativism, even though I'm going to still be a moral relativist in every other way. Right? You see, this is like throughout this book. He said that you can't prove faith, and you can't prove no faith. You can't prove there is a God. You can't prove there is no God. But that doesn't mean that there aren't better ideas. Faith seems to be a better idea because it is more consistent with what we know to be true about the world and who we are and how we behave and how we operate and how we think. There is just a tremendous amount of inconsistency in some of these other ideas. And so you literally have to ignore what you're actually confessing to believe to uphold some of those ideas. So that's the difficulty. Big difficulty. All right, difficult issue of human rights. Talking about a major crisis in the field of human rights. Talking about human rights in Asia, Africa, South America. That's the only language in which the opponents and victims of murderous regimes and civil wars can raise their voices against violence, repression, and persecution. So, human rights are being violated all over the globe. But how do we help people like that when we don't believe in a God or any sort of moral obligation or any basis for moral obligation? Sorry, that was too good. I couldn't stare at it anymore. All right. So this reveals the enormous importance of the morality of human rights, which Michael J. Perry defines as the twofold conviction that every human being has inherent dignity and that it is obligatory that we order our lives in accordance with this fact. It is wrong to violate the equal dignity of other human beings. But why should we believe that? On what does this dignity depend? He's quoting, using some ideas from Alan Dershowitz here. Some believe human rights come from God. Of course, Alan Dershowitz rejects that answer since so many people are agnostic. Others say human rights come from nature, that nature, if it's examined, will reveal some kinds of behavior are fitting with the way things are and are right. However, Dershowitz correctly points out that nature thrives on violence and predation on the survival of the fittest. There is no way to derive the concept of the dignity of every individual from the way things really work in nature, right? And I think maybe it was Annie Dillard or somebody else, a Christian writer who spent some time living out in the wilderness trying to get away from civilization, thought being closer to nature would be better and soften her, or give her more peace and calm and comfort and joy and love. And actually it was the exact opposite, because she just watched the strong eat the weak every day out in the woods, because that's the way nature is. So another theory claims that human rights are created by us. So these are the only three ways. The first two don't work. So let's just say, well, they're created by us. We just decide. Okay, great. Well, there are some major problems with that idea. What if the majority decides it is not in their interest to grant human rights? If rights are nothing but a majority creation, then there is nothing to appeal to when they are legislated out of existence. And Alan Dershowitz himself is quoting a guy named Ronald Dworkin when he says that this idea of this basis for human rights is just simply inadequate. It is no answer to say that if individuals have these rights, then the community is better off in the long run. Because when we say someone has a right to speak his mind freely, we mean he is entitled to do so, even if this would not be in the general interest, right? So freedom of speech says you can say whatever you want. No one can harm you because of what you say. No one can come after you, even if what you're saying is not helpful and not good for the common interest. That's exactly when that freedom is most necessary. If human rights are created by majorities, of what use are they? Their value lies in that they can be used to insist that majorities honor the dignity of minorities and individuals, despite their conception of their greater good. Rights cannot be created. They must be discovered, or they are of no value. As Dworkin concludes, if we want to defend individual rights, we must try to discover something beyond utility that argues for these rights. What could that something be? Dershowitz, Dworkin, neither one really gives an answer. They kind of end up appealing to a form of majority rule anyway. Again, just a lot of inconsistency and lame answers without God. Now, law professor Michael J. Perry responds, the non-religious source of normativity for Dworkin is the great value, quote, we attach to every human being understood as a creative masterpiece. It is, quote, our wonder at the process that produced new lives from old ones. But to whom is Dworkin referring with his we and our? Did the Nazis value the Jews intrinsically? The conspicuous problem with Dworkin's secular argument for rights is that Dworkin assumes a consensus among human agents that does not exist and never has existed. So we still think human rights are a good thing. We still have this innate sense in us. But that's not a majority opinion. It's not. So it is clear that there is a religious ground for the morality of human rights. It is far from clear that there is a non-religious ground, a secular ground for human rights. This guy, Perry, lays out Nietzsche's well-known insistence that if God is dead, any and all morality of love and human rights is baseless. If there is no God, argues Nietzsche, Sartre, and others, there can be no good reason to be kind, to be loving, or to work for peace. Perry quotes Philippa Foot, who says that secular thinkers accepted the idea that there is no God and no given meaning to human life, but have not really joined battle with Nietzsche about morality. By and large, we have just gone on taking moral judgments for granted as if nothing had happened. Why do we keep on doing this? He goes on here into this section on the grand, quote, says who. So, who says, right? Oh, you can't do that. Says who? That's the idea. It's really a problem. If there is no God, there is no way to say any one action is moral and another immoral, but only I like this. If that is the case, who gets the right to put their subjective, arbitrary moral feelings into law? You may say the majority has the right to make the law, but do you mean that then the majority has the right to vote to exterminate a minority? If you say no, that is wrong, then you are back to square one. Who says that the majority has a moral obligation not to kill the minority? Why should your moral convictions be obligatory for those in opposition? Why should your view prevail over the will of the majority? The fact is, if there is no God, then all moral statements are arbitrary, all moral valuations are subjective and internal, and there can be no external moral standard by which a person's feelings and values are judged. And then he quotes a law professor from Yale, Arthur Leff. As things are now, everything is up for grabs. Nevertheless, napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked. Buying and selling each other is depraved. There is such a thing as evil altogether now. Says who? God help us. People just despair, just hopelessness, like, because there is nothing to fall back on without God, and yet we still have these strong feelings, this strong sense of right and wrong, and not only that, but imposing that idea of right and wrong on so many other people and on society and on other societies as well, other cultures. An atheist thinker reluctantly writes, only someone who is religious can speak seriously of the sacred. We may say that all human beings are inestimably precious, that they are ends in themselves, that they are owed unconditional respect, that they possess inalienable rights, and of course that they possess inalienable dignity. In my judgment, these are ways of trying to say what we feel a need to say when we are estranged from the conceptual resources, that is, God. We need to say it. Not one of these statements about human beings has the power of the religious way of speaking, that we are sacred because God loves us, his children. So Leff is not simply concluding that there is no basis for human rights without God. He is also pointing out, as are Dershowitz and Dworkin in their own way, that despite the fact that we can't justify or ground human rights in a world without God, we still know they exist. Leff is not just speaking generically, but personally. Without God, he can't justify moral obligation, and yet he can't not know it exists. This is, again, what Keller said at the outset of the chapter, that we still have these things. We still have this strong sense of morality because that's who we are. That's how God made us, and that there is, in fact, a God, and that's why we have these things going on. Here's Annie Dillard. This is what I was talking about earlier. I quoted, there's a quote here about, this is for a section on the argument for God from the violence of nature. And so this is essentially saying, when we look at nature, here's Annie Dillard. She tells a quote about, it's actually a pretty good quote. I'll read it to you. There is not a person in the world that behaves as badly as praying mantises. But wait, you say, there is no right or wrong in nature. Right and wrong is a human concept. Precisely, we are moral creatures in an amoral world. Or consider the alternative. It is only human feeling that is freakishly amiss. All right, then, it is our emotions that are amiss. We are freaks. The world is fine, and let us all go have lobotomies to restore us to a natural state. We can leave, lobotomized, go back to the creek and live on its banks as untroubled as any muskrat or reed. You first. Right, so basically, the only way, what's wrong is us, right? Everything else, the strong eat the weak. It's violent, it's terrible, and yet we have this sense that that's not right, that there's something wrong with the world, there's something broken about the world. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on in this book, but there's a brokenness, I think Christians would say, because of sin, and we see that, and we see that something's wrong with it, and that's because God has put something in us to help us see that. And the only way for us not to see it and to just be okay with it is to have a lobotomy. It's kind of what Andy Dillard's saying here. All of nature is based on violence. Stronger individuals or groups kill weaker ones. And yet we believe it's wrong for humans to do that. Why? Why? There's only one way out of this conundrum. We can pick up the biblical account of things and see if it explains our moral sense any better than a secular view. If the world was made by a God of peace, justice, and love, then that is why we know that violence, oppression, and hate are wrong. If the world is fallen, broken, and needs to be redeemed, that explains the violence and disorder we see. If you believe human rights are a reality, then it makes much more sense that God exists than he does not. If you insist on a secular view of the world, and yet you continue to pronounce some things right and some things wrong, then I hope you see the deep disharmony between the world your intellect has devised and the real world and God that your heart knows exists. This leads us to a crucial question. If a premise, there is no God, leads to a conclusion you know isn't true, napalming babies is culturally relative, then why not change the premise? And so that's, I think, ultimately for you skeptics and non-believers out there, and for our friends and family who are like that. I mean, ultimately, this is a tremendous inconsistency. The secular way of approaching life and the world simply is illogical and ultimately doesn't hold up to intense scrutiny like this. So, which is not what most people think. Most people think faith falls apart under scrutiny. Interesting. The endless, pointless litigation of existence. He's not tried to prove the existence of God to you. His goal has been to show you that you already know God is there. To some degree, I have been treating the non-existence of God as an intellectual problem, but it is much more than that. It not only makes all moral choices meaningless, but it makes all life meaningless too. And now he's got a quote from playwright Arthur Miller, from character Quentin in After the Fall. Quentin says, "For many years I looked at life like a case at law. It was a series of proofs. When you're young, you prove how brave you are or smart. Then, what a good lover. Then, a good father. Finally, how wise or powerful or whatever. But underlying it all, I see now there was a presumption that one moved on an upward path towards some elevation where, God knows what, I would be justified or even condemned. A verdict, anyway. I think now that my disaster really began when I looked up one day and the bench was empty. No judge in sight, and all that remained was the endless argument with oneself. This pointless litigation of existence before an empty bench, which of course is another way of saying despair." So, it's not just inconsistent, illogical, doesn't support the way we actually think, behave, believe in our inner selves, deep down. It also makes all of life completely meaningless. That, in some way, there's some sense within us all that we're trying to live up to something. But if in the end that bench is empty, that there is no one, there is no reckoning. There is no, we're not doing anything for anyone, not even for ourselves, because in the end it's all completely meaningless. Well, that's despair. That's complete and utter hopelessness. It's not just not having a basis for human rights. It's we all live as if it is better to seek peace instead of war, to tell the truth instead of lying, to care and nurture rather than to destroy. We believe that these choices are not pointless, that it matters which way we choose to live. Yet, if the cosmic bench is truly empty, then who says that one choice is better than the others? We can argue about it, but it's just pointless arguing, endless litigation. If the bench is truly empty, then the whole span of human civilization, even if it lasts a few million years, will be just an infinitesimally brief spark in relation to the oceans of dead time that preceded it and will follow it. There will be no one around to remember any of it. Whether we are loving or cruel, in the end, would make no difference at all. So if we get to that point and recognize that reality, the ultimate conclusion of a lot of this thinking, there are two options. We can simply refuse to think out the implications of all this, just kind of ignore it, pretend it's not there. Hold to our intellectual belief in an empty bench and yet live as if our choices are meaningful. Why would we do that? A cynic might say that this is a way of having one's cake and eating it too. That is, you get the benefit of having a God without the cost of following him, but there's no integrity in that, right? So ultimately, you have to live without integrity to uphold that, to say that, yeah, no, it's all meaningless, but I'm going to act like life is meaningful. The other option is to recognize that you do know there is a God. You could accept the fact that you live as if beauty and love have meaning, as if there is meaning in life, as if human beings have an inherent dignity, all because you know God exists. It is dishonest to live as if he is there and yet fail to acknowledge the one who has given you all these gifts. So, there's a lot there, as always. I hope you found it helpful. And if you have questions, you want to talk about it, let me know. I'll be happy to do that. Have a great night, and just think about how unbelievably consistent, reasonable, and rational it is to believe in God, whether you do believe in God or don't at this point. And consider finding the most consistent set of beliefs that explain why you believe and think and act the way you do, not what's most convenient. And, again, this is sweet Jesus, because ice cream is sweet, but Jesus is sweeter. Ultimately, I think accepting that, acknowledging it, moving in the groove, so to speak, and getting in line with reality and living with the kind of internal integrity is ultimately, it doesn't make your life perfect by any stretch of the imagination. People that follow Jesus are killed every day. People that follow Jesus experience all kinds of difficulties. But people that follow Jesus, that internal integrity helps them navigate the challenges of life in a way that no one else can. And so I hope that this is helping you get to that point. Or if you're already there, I hope this is helping equip you in your conversations with people outside the faith. And again, any questions, please let me know. Look forward to seeing you next time. Take care. God bless.